world of Tamriel is vast and varied, with many different civilizations, cultures, races, and countries. These have risen and fallen throughout the history of the continent, being absorbed by a more powerful nation, emerging from the ashes of a fallen empire, or rising through revolution. In order to understand the history of the nations and races of Tamriel, we first have to understand the timelines and eras of Tamriel. And in today's episode of Lore and Loot, we're going to take a look at the timeline of Tamriel's history. The history of Tamriel is divided into eras. These eras don't last a set number of years, but rather represent more of a time period. This is going to get a little tricky in certain parts, because time in the world of Tamriel does not always follow a linear path. Now, before I go on, I will have to take note here that we're going to be discussing a lot of different things today, and we're not going to go into great detail about all of them. For example, there's going to be a lot of talk about the gods and creation and stuff. I'm not going to go into it in much detail, only as much as necessary as to talk about the topic of hand, which is the eras. In addition to all of this, we're only going to be discussing the first two eras today. The rest will be saved for other episodes. The first era of time is what is known as the Dawn Era. This is the time before time, when time itself was not really a concept at all. There are no metrics by which to measure time, only events, and the order of their happening is a nebular concept, if it's even possible to describe. The information I've gathered comes from the various books dedicated to attempting to describe the creation story. The two main ones are the Monomyth and the Annotated Anuad, although there will be some few other tomes in the future that we'll be discussing. Existence begins with the void. No matter who you ask, a Khajiit or a Dunmer, a Nord or a High Elf, everyone has their own version of essentially the same conflict. In the void, two entities emerge. Depending on your religion, you know them as Anu and Padme, Anuiel and Sithis, Anhur and Fadomai, or simply is and is not. Essentially, order and chaos. For the sake of simplicity, I will be referring to these entities by Anu and Padme, but just remember that Anu is order, while Padme is chaos. As these two entities traverse the void, smaller entities were brought into existence. These beings are the Et Ada, the original spirits. The Annotated Anuad tells us this version of how they came to be. As Anu and Padme wandered the void, the interplay of light and darkness created Nur. Both Anu and Padme were amazed and delighted with her appearance, but she loved Anu, and Padme retreated from them in bitterness. Nur became pregnant, but before she gave birth, Padme returned, professing his love for Nur. She told him that she loved only Anu, and Padme beat her in rage. Anu returned, fought Padme, and cast them outside time. Nur gave birth to creation, but died from her injuries soon after. In any event, the original spirits came to be. Various of these spirits came into being, and all of this happened for a duration of time that could have been seconds or years or millennia. These spirits are what we know today to be the Aedra and the Daedra. Now, we don't know how they actually came to be. The Monomyth simply tells us that from Anu and Padme sprung the Et Ada. The Annotated Anuad story is that once Anu found out that Padme had attacked Nur, they fought, with Anu eventually winning. Padme's blood became the Daedra, and their combined blood became the Aedra. Anyways, at some point, two important entities come into existence, Akatosh and Lorkhan. Akatosh is the god of time. Akatosh goes by many names depending on which religion, or rather which version of the creation story you're reading. However, he appears in every version. The second one is Lorkhan, the trickster god. He also appears in every creation story, and like Akatosh, comes with different names. Whichever version you prefer, when Akatosh comes into being, time begins. At this point, some of the other higher spirits take a more permanent shape. Lorcan convinces some of the other Et Ada to create the mortal realm, which we know as Mundus. At this point, the Et Ada created the first races of Mundus, and it is also at this point Lorcan receives his nickname, the Trickster God. Because after the Et Ada create life, they realize that their power had waned. Many of them vanished from existence altogether because of their efforts, and the ones that remained were weakened. Because of this, many of the Et Ada decided to abandon Mundus and left. A few others remained, attempting to prevent the world they had just created from disappearing. The ones that remained are known as the Elnafey. The Elnafey eventually become the races of Mer and Men and the Hist. Some were able to gather together. We call these the Old Elnafey. Others were scattered around the world, the so-called Wandering Elnafey. The Wandering Elnafey eventually come across their cousins, but instead of being welcomed with open arms, the Old Elnafey looked down on them, and war ravaged the land. Parts of the world sank beneath the ocean, and Tamriel itself is created along with the other continents. Akavir, Atmora, Piondonia, and Yokuda. Now, some of the Elnafey found themselves on an island that they called Aldmeris, and these are the first elves, the Aldmer, and would eventually splinter and become the different types of elves many years later. Finally, let's talk about the convention of the Et Ada. The spirits held a convention to decide Lorcan's fate. For deceiving them all, the Et Ada rip out his heart. The Altmer account then states that Aruiel, their version of Akatosh, strung the heart on an arrow, and with his legendary bow shot the arrow into the sky. The arrow landed in the water, which created an enormous volcano, Red Mountain. This convention of the Et Ada in what we know now as Durrani Tower is the last event of the Dawn Era, and the Merethic Era begins. The Merethic Era is the first instance that linear time exists, yet we still have very few set dates for the events that transpired during this age. During this period of time, the Aldmer leave their historical home of Aldmeris and settle on Somerset Isle, and eventually found settlements on the mainland of Tamriel, displacing the beast folk who lived there. Also in the Merethic Era, a division of the Aldmer, known as the Velothi, left their ancestral homelands after a rift with the Aldmer over ancestral worship. One of the important events of this separation is the eating of Trinimac. Trinimac was an important god of the Aldmer. At the time, the Velothi were attempting to leave Somerset Isle. Trinimac and his followers stopped Veloth's followers. The Daedric prince Boethia, whom the Velothi worshipped, came down and ate Trinimac. Using Trinimac's own voice, Boethia told Trinimac's followers that Trinimac had been lying to them the entire time they had been worshipping him. And then he quite literally relieved himself in front of them, with Trinimac now in the form of excrement, having become Malakath. The people who remained loyal to Trinimac, now Malakath, became the orcs, who were then banished. The followers of Veloth became the Chimer, who were then able to continue their journey. They followed their prophet, Veloth, who led them out to the east, where they finally settled in what they called Resdayn, modern-day Morrowind. However, around the same time, the Dwemer had built a vast underground empire, ranging from modern-day Skyrim to Morrowind. The Chimer and the Dwemer skirmished many times, as the Chimer considered the Dwemer heathens, but also coveted their land. The Velothi Chimer eventually receded and evolved from their golden age to a period of small, squabbling tribes that eventually become the great houses of Morrowind. Meanwhile, In northern Skyrim, the Atmoran king Ysgramor and his two sons, Yingal and Yilgal, along with a large host of Atmorans, sailed down from the continent of Atmora, which is north of Tamriel, and built the settlement of Sarthal. Little is known about Atmora, but it's generally believed that Ysgramor was not the first Atmoran to come to Tamriel. Either because of overpopulation or civil war, many Atmorans had already come down to settle in Tamriel. In fact, these people had already formed societies, as they were the ancestors of the modern-day Bretons, Cyrodiils, and the people of Hammerfell. These people were known as the Needs, and very little is known about them properly. Nevertheless, they appear to have been able to settle in Tamriel mostly peacefully with the elves there, but for some reason, Ysgramor and his people were not able to remain peaceful. The account of why the elves of Skyrim attacked Sarthal in the infamous Night of Tears is debated. The elves, of course, say that they were provoked, and the Nords claim that it was an unprovoked attack, but whatever the reason, Ysgramor and his two sons managed to flee and sail back to Atmora. It's interesting to note that in the book Frontier, Conquest, and Accommodation, A Social History of Cyrodiil, the author notes that it was likely the Nords who were the aggressors, the theory being that perhaps because they were so close to Atmora and were able to call on reinforcements, they felt a little more able to be aggressive. And in fact, that's exactly what Ysgramor does. He sailed back to Atmora, gathered his famous 500 companions, and he took revenge on the Snow Elves, driving them out of Skyrim. The final event of the Merethic Era, and what brings about the First Era, is the establishment of the Camoran dynasty in Valenwood. The elves of Valenwood had up to this time been wild, but King Eplier was able to unite the Bosmer under one banner. The Camoran dynasty lasted centuries, and is worth its own discussion probably, but for our purposes, the establishment of the dynasty marks year 1 of the First Era. And that brings us to the end of this first part of the eras of Tamriel. Today, we discussed the Dawn Era, the time before time, when the gods created the world. And we talked about the Merethic Era, the prehistoric period of Tamriel, when the first divisions of man and Mer took place. And the next time we tackle this subject, we're going to take a look at the First Era. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next episode of Lore and Loot.